tonight. My name is Laura Martin, and I'm the co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society. And I'm glad you're with us, either in person or virtually on Zoom or watching on TV. Thank you for coming to hear about Exeter's legends and lore. I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing our programs to our members and friends virtually, for which we are always grateful. Next month's program will be on Tuesday, March 4th, right here at 7 p.m. In a program sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities, art historian Jane O'Neill will be back to talk about fierce females in art. We hope you'll join us. And if you haven't already seen our new Exeter History Minute, in keeping with the theme of legends and lore, we explored the story of the Great Moon Hoax of 1835, which is not to be confused with the Great Moon Hoax of 1969. Just kidding. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. Not only will it help our speaker hear you, but it will allow those online to hear you as well. If you are on Zoom or Facebook, please write your questions in the comments section, and we'll do our best to ask them on your behalf. And now for the main event. It's always a pleasure for me to introduce my friend and coworker, Barbara Rimkunas. Barbara grew up in Falmouth, Maine, and earned her bachelor's and master's degrees at the universities of Maine and New Hampshire, respectively. In her past lives, she has worked as an archaeologist and in patient registration at Exeter Hospital ER. Most importantly to us, however, she has been the curator at the Exeter Historical Society since 2000. You've probably read her historically speaking columns and or seen her present programs right here and or caught her in one or more of our over 145 Exeter History Minutes. She's pretty awesome. Over to you, Barbara.
Is this on? Yep. Okay, good, because we didn't test the microphones. That would have been crazy. Okay, so I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people, who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Owaasak, the land, the waterways, the flora, and the fauna throughout the generations. So maybe we should call our program not Exeter Lore and Legends, but maybe Misquamscook Lore and Legends. But we're not going to do that. All right, now I'm going to test and see if this is working. We'll start with this house here in Exeter. Now, Exeter, like most places, has a lot of legends and lore, outright lies, and some factual things that make us unique. And the fun part about living in any community is following how the stories move from time to time. This is a house located on Pine Street, and it is called the Moses Kent House. And I'm going to go back to it in a minute, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because back in 2020, I was following the best place to follow legends and lore, the community Facebook page, right? And if you've ever spent time on any community Facebook page, you know that it's filled with lost pets, and in here, people griping about traffic and parking and why have the electric rates gone up and all this stuff that you hear about. But you also hear a lot of urban legends and crazy stories told. This house pops up almost every October because it seems like it's a creepy Halloween-y house. And we'll talk about it a little more in a minute. But first, we're going to travel back in time a little bit to the 1790s. This is not the 1790s. This is Charles Bell, who was governor of the state in the 1800s, and he was also a historian. And he wrote the first history book about Exeter. And it takes the time period from 1638 until 1888 into its history. And most of it is a very dry read. It's meant to be informational. It tells you who was the town moderator in 1780, all that important information that everybody needs to know. But tucked in the very back of the book, under a section called Miscellaneous, there's this really strange story called the Whitecaps. And when you first read it, it's like, this doesn't even seem like it should be in this book, because it's not something that Charles Bell would write. He was very meticulous about making sure that he had his facts right. And he checked and double-checked, and he went over things, and he went through all the early records and read all the bad handwriting. And instead, there's this little story that he tells. Now, he came to town in the 1830s to be a lawyer. And so he was close enough to this story. It was within 30, 40 years of when he arrived in town. So he would have known people who knew this story of the Whitecaps. The story goes, toward the close of the last century, so in the 1790s, was a time when people believed in magic and witches, and into town came a strange man who called himself Rainsford Rogers. And he talks about how, he was originally from Connecticut, and he convinced people in other communities that there were ghosts who could tell you where hidden treasure was buried. And people believed him, okay? Con men have existed for a long time. It's not something new. So he tells the story about how a group of men in town, and he said they were upright men of standing, were convinced by this character, Rainsford Rogers, that he would be able to find gold. Now, this was not a unique thing to do. This was something that really existed. There were people who would do this. They would take you into the woods and they would dig for gold. Where was this gold supposed to have come from? Well, in some parts of the country, they would say, well, the British left it after the war, so they hid all their gold. Other places, they would say that it was, gold coins from ancient peoples. There were all sorts of reasons why there might be coin hoards buried in the ground. Rainsford Rogers was even able, because he was pretty good with explosives and such, that he could conjure up like a little tiny explosion or make the ground glow, and it would make them really think it was going to happen. So he took this group of men out into the woods, and they each had to kick in some money. Of course, you have to pay the man who was supposed to be showing you where the gold is. And he'd take them into the woods. He made them all wear white caps. I think so he could see them better, because the darkness back then was dark. It's not like now where you go out at night and there's a lot of ambient light. There was no ambient light. Dark was very dark. And they went out into the woods and they started digging. Night after night, they were digging. And if they started to feel discouraged at all, he would convince them, no, you got to keep going. You got to keep, I'm sure this is the spot. Now, whatever he used to divine where the gold was supposed to be, we're not too sure of. There were a number of methods that were used by these characters. This was a standard con. Sometimes they would use a seeing stone, where they would put this, any kind of unusual looking rock into a hat, and they'd stare into it, and then they'd raise their head and say, I know where it is, it's over there. Joseph Smith, who founded the Latter-day Saints, actually got his start as a seer stone, and he did things like that. Or they might have used a divining rod. Now, you're mostly from New England. You're all nodding. You've all heard of a divining rod. I think I first saw one on Gilligan's Island, but there you go. Frequently, people say they're used to find water. And in New England, that's easy because there's water everywhere. The U.S. Geological Survey says that they are nonsense. But, hey, it seems it works. Not going to worry about it. So at some point, he decided that the men's enthusiasm was lagging, and so he did what he has done before. He dressed himself up as a ghost and stood aside and started doing this big whoa kind of thing, and we need to find the gold. And one of the men is said to have said, "Excuse me, Mr. Ghost, can you speak up? I can't hear you." It's an important part of the story. And eventually Rainsford Rogers tells them, I have to get a new divining rod, and I'm going to have to go to Philadelphia to get it. So you're going to have to raise, I think it was $300 for me, so that I can go down and buy this. And through a lot of work, because that was a lot of money back then, they raised the funds, and he said, I'm going to Philadelphia, and they never saw him again. So that's an interesting story, and Bell ends it by saying, and the man who said that, Mr. Ghost, I need you to speak louder, got ribbed about it for the rest of his life. Bell does not give the names of the men in his book, and he's pretty good about listing names, but he wasn't going to embarrass these guys in his book. Even though he wrote it in 1888, they're probably long dead by then, but he wasn't going to do it. So I got interested in that story, and it turns out that Rainsford Rogers was a real person. He pulled this con all over the place. He did it across the southern states. He did it in New Jersey, which was written up in a book that was called The Morristown Ghost, where it's a pretty similar pattern to what he did to the men in Exeter. And he never gets caught, and he never has to face any kind of criminal charges because nobody ever wants to press charges because they're too embarrassed. So he got away with it over and over. Now, there's a lot of theory that he probably wrote the book himself so that he could make even more money. That would not be too surprising. So that's our first story of our first sort of con that happened in Exeter. Here's a really cool painting of these people were called gold diggers. That didn't used to mean a woman who was looking for a man's money. It used to mean these people who took you out into the woods who literally dug for gold. No one ever found any. It was like looking for Bigfoot, but the con was always there. This is actually called The Adventure of Sam the Black Fisherman, which involves gold diggers within the story, and the painting was done in 1832. It's currently at the Brooklyn Museum. So this was a real thing. I mean, it was not a real thing. It's a con, but it was a real thing. Questionable story. And I'm going to call this section The Problem of Amos Tuck. Now, if you're from Exeter, you've heard of Amos Tuck. He's kind of a local hero. He was a lawyer and a politician in the middle part of the 19th century. He was a friend of Abraham Lincoln. And in Exeter lore, he founded the Republican Party. Not just in Exeter, but everywhere. So that's important to know that there are two things you need to know about him. He knew Abraham Lincoln, and he founded the Republican Party. So the question is, when I first started working at the Historical Society, that's what I was told. And it was like, yes, that's what we want. We want the founder of the Republican Party of Lincoln in my town. That is awesome. There is a plaque for him dedicated in the town. So this is very important, and we want to prove this. So one of our researchers at the Historical Society, Mark Willis, was looking into Amos Tuck to just nail down all of these details so we are absolutely sure about these things. And he kept coming across things that didn't match the story. First of all, Amos Tuck, real person and an honorable man, okay? And he was born in 1810 in Parsonsfield, Maine. His father wanted him to be a farmer. He did not want to be a farmer. He definitely did not want to do that. And he manages to get himself through school. He goes to Dartmouth, and he passes the bar in New Hampshire. His family, his extended family, was from Hampton. And he comes to Exeter to work as a lawyer. So I'll go with actually the later part of his story first. Did he stay with Amos Tuck in the Amos Tuck house, which is on Front Street, when Abraham Lincoln visited and spoke right here in 1860? And the answer to that is, no, he did not. There was a sign on that house, it's probably still there, that says that Abraham Lincoln stayed there. And Amos Tuck's son, Edward Tuck, said, yeah, I think he stayed there. But he wasn't there. He was in college at the time, so he doesn't know if Abraham Lincoln, he wasn't here. So anyway, so here's what we found with Amos Tuck. Amos Tuck always leaves a paper trail. Always. And all you have to do is dig through the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of correspondence to try to find what you're looking for. Here's a letter that he wrote to Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln had left Exeter. And it's also in his handwriting, which is a great, fun thing to read. But right in the middle it says, "I very much regretted that I was absent when you were at Exeter, and was sorry you did not call upon my family even in my absence." So he's basically bawling out Abraham Lincoln, if you can imagine a person doing that. The two men, so he didn't stay with Amos Tuck's family. Amos Tuck wasn't here at the time. Amos Tuck was out checking out railroad ventures at the time. So there's that little story, which is too bad. We don't really know where Abraham Lincoln stayed when he came to Exeter. He was here for 4 nights. We don't know where he was. It'd be nice to know, but we don't. The other thing about Amos Tuck is that he wrote an autobiography like the last couple of years before he died, and it was published in serialized format in the Exeter newsletter, our local newspaper. And he wrote in great detail about his life. And the thing that he was most proud of was his political movement. He was what was called a free soil politician, as was Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln only served 1 term in the House of Representatives in Washington, and that just happened to coincide with when Amos Tuck was there, so that's how the two men got to know one another. They were both free soil men. As the country was expanding westward, more and more states were joining, and the question was always, is this going to be a free state or is this going to be a slave state? And if you think we're divided now, this is, I was going to say nothing compared to the 1840s, but it might be. But compared to the 1840s and 50s, that was another time in our history when we were a very divided country. And the question was always the intractable question of slavery. And so the balance had to be maintained at all times. So anytime a new state came in, it was vitally important to know free state or slave state. Texas comes in, slave state. Missouri comes in, slave state. Maine comes in, free state. You know, what do you do about the rest of these? Kansas and Nebraska and all these new states coming in. Lincoln and Tuck both were firmly on the side of free state politics. In his autobiography, he writes about a meeting that he held at the First Parish Church parsonage, where he got a group of different political parties together and they united in their free soil politics. So that was the most important thing to him. What he does not mention at any point in time is founding the Republican Party. And that seemed odd. So when Mark Willis was looking into this, he was curious to find out, why doesn't Amos Tuck ever mention that he named the Republican Party? And there's a reason for that. First of all, here's our sign. I am not saying take it down. It was put there for a reason. The story about Amos Tuck founding the Republican Party starts in 1887, when a letter to the editor is published in the Exeter newsletter by a man named Homer Batchelder. And in this letter, he says, Amos Tuck named the Republican Party, and he did it on October 12th, 1853. Months before the Republican Party is publicized in 1854. But it was here, and it was at a meeting, and here's the name of 14 other people who were there. Conveniently, in 1887, they're all dead. So there's no corroborating evidence on that. And he says it was a secret meeting, and no one took minutes, and no one publicized it, and Amos Tuck doesn't talk about it. So all of this was a little suspect. Every subsequent story about Amos Tuck naming the Republican Party goes back to the Batchelder letter. There's nothing before it, and there's only the Batchelder letter afterwards. There's no other proof of this meeting. So that made it difficult. Mark keeps researching. Let's see what else. Oh, the meeting was supposed to be held at the Squamscott Hotel, which here is depicted as Gorham Hall. It was for a while a dormitory for Phillips Exeter Academy. And it was owned and operated at the time by A.P. Blake, Abraham Phineas Blake. Today it's called A.P. Blake's Hotel and its offices, so it still exists. And that's where the plaque is. And so this is where it was supposed to have happened. Here is the letter. And for some reason, Homer Batchelder really wanted to beef up the reputation of Amos Tuck. Here's the problem, though. I said that Amos Tuck always leaves a paper trail. He's supposed to be at a meeting in Exeter on October 12th, 1853, except he's in Chicago on October 10th, 1853, And it takes about 5 days for the train to get from Illinois to here. And he writes this letter to his son, Edward, who is in Exeter. And if he'd written an alibi, it couldn't be more Loctite. I mean, he describes Chicago, and then he talks about how he's heading interior of the state by the cars, which is the train, 50 miles to Galena. And there is no way he's coming home for this meeting. So then you go through all the things in your head. Maybe Homer Batchelder just got his dates wrong. Maybe that's it. Maybe it came later. But there's nothing that lines up with this story. And the first person to ever seem to use the word Republican Party, at least in the East, is Horace Greeley. So it might be Horace Greeley. There's also Ripon, Wisconsin, which also has a pretty good claim to the Republican Party. So I'm going to have to say that I don't think Amos Tuck named the Republican Party. But he was fantastic with free soil politics. And that was an important movement because that pushes the question of abolition forward. So let's keep that. And so don't throw anything at me right now. We'll move on to something a little more lighthearted. This is the Gilman Garrison House, still standing. It's on the corner of Water Street and Clifford Street here in Exeter. It was built in 1709 by the Gilman family. And it's a garrison house because it is built of these big logs so that if there was some sort of native attack on the town, everybody could run into this one building, I think so that the indigenous people would know where to find everyone and then burn it down. But it seemed like a good idea. So what about this house? We're going to talk a little bit about tunnels. Most towns have stories of tunnels. Oh, people are nodding like you've heard this. You've heard about the Garrison Gilman having tunnels. Okay. Most places have stories of tunnels. Now, tunnels are notoriously hard to build. It takes a lot of work to dig it out and to shore up the walls and make sure that this thing isn't going to collapse. And you better have a good reason why you're building tunnels underground. So this story that surrounds the Garrison House is that the tunnels were built to protect against native attack. And there are varying stories about where the tunnels led and what they would be used for. Interestingly, the stories of the tunnels, remember with these local legends and possible urban legends, you always go back to when is the first time you hear the story, okay? So the first time we hear the Rainsford Roberts story was when Charles Bell is telling it, and the first time that we hear about Amos Tuck is when Homer Batchelder is talking about it. The first time we hear about the Garrison House having tunnels is around 1900. So the Garrison House has been here since 1709, and no one for 200 years has noticed that there's tunnels there. And then all of a sudden, the house is owned by Jenny Harvey and her sister. Her sister actually owned it. Her sister's name was Asneth Darling. They owned the house, and the story begins to circulate that there are tunnels, and that the tunnels go under the river into the fields. Jenny Harvey was a teacher. She taught at, I believe, the seminary and other places as well, and she loved to tell that story to school kids. So generations of school kids from about 1915 onward have heard this story. And I don't know when they stopped telling the stories. I think it's like the 1950s because I keep meeting people who have heard it. So it's been around a long time. So in the 1930s, when the government was doing, tracking all these older homes in the country, as part of the WPA, they were looking at the house and they decided to ask local people, where are the tunnels? Show us where you think they go. And they made this diagram. And as you can see, there are 3 different tunnels. Is this going to show me a pointer? Okay, there's one up here. Well, there's one up here, and one down here, and one over here that goes under Great Bridge out. But that's the most common one you hear about is this one here. So to build a tunnel underneath a river would be very hard. And there's nothing in our town records that mentions the kind of civic project that would take. When we took the dam out in 2016, all of that under the river there is all ledge. It's just rock. So there's really nowhere to dig. You'd have to blast. So that's one problem. Another problem is You can't find these tunnels inside the building. Jenny Harvey, and later a teacher at the seminary named Elizabeth Baker, used to take people on field trips. Whole groups of kids would go down to that house, and they would take a field trip, and they'd go down to the basement, and you would meet people, until just recently, who would say, I remember the tunnels. We went down into this dark place, and like the walls were drippy, and I remember it. But they weren't probably going to the tunnels. They were probably just going into the creepy old basement, because, old houses have creepy old basements. So they could never find these tunnels. The U.S. Department of the Interior finally, after doing the survey, said they tried to find the tunnels and they could not locate them. Robbins Gilman, who wrote a book about the house, later conceded that and his mother conceded, Frances Perry Dudley, that no matter how hard you look for them, there's no tunnels there. There's no trace. So there are no tunnels there. The other time that you hear about tunnels is when people start talking about the Underground Railroad. This house on Cass Street is sometimes told to school kids, even today I think, that there were tunnels that went down to the river. This house is perhaps 1/16 of a mile from the river. And we can start by saying that in the town of Exeter, we've gone through the police records and we can't find any incidences of fugitive slaves being arrested or tracked through town. It just doesn't seem to be the route that people were taking. The Underground Railroad has a lot of legends around it. And I think it was a way of people in the 1950s and the 1960s, mostly white people, to say, well, there were some good people. We were all helping with the Underground Railroad, Quakers, it's all good. But most of the time, the Underground Railroad, which was kept quiet, and there's not a lot of documentation about it, but it was frequently free black people helping other black people. And they were sneaking on trains and sneaking on boats and not staying in places very long. The image that we have of people running through the woods following the North Star is not terribly accurate. It was more likely that you were going with a guide who was helping you. So we don't have any evidence of any of that happening in Exeter. Not unusual, like I said, Underground Railroad. People didn't talk about it. This house does not have tunnels under it. The land underneath it is right next door to my house. The land underneath it is sandy and shifts, and like we have a sump pump that runs 24/7 in my basement. My neighbors do not, but they do have a hidden room though. But it's really not a hidden room. It's just sort of a panel behind built-in shelving in their living room, where there's a space there, which they use, to run wires for utilities today. But another case of people being told that there are tunnels, but there's no tunnels. And remember what I said about dark? When it's dark, it's dark. If you have to go 1/16 of a mile to get to the river in the dark, you probably don't want a tunnel. That's probably more dangerous than just running, because that could collapse right on top of you. So sorry, no tunnels there either. Let's talk about the IOKA. There's a lot of good legends and lore that go with the IOKA. The IOKA, which is no longer a movie theater today, so sorry, was built in 1915 by a man named Edward Mayer. He was a local traffic judge. There he is. For a long time, there was publicity going around with the IOKA that Edward Mayer was related to Louis B. Mayer. Anybody heard that? Some nods, right. Yeah, they are not related. For one thing, I believe Edward Mayer is older than Louis B. Mayer. The story was that Edward Mayer was the nephew of Louis B. Mayer, who was known, of course, for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And he did get his start in Haverhill, but he's not related to Edward Mayer. Edward Mayer is a German Methodist from New York State. Louis B. Mayer is a Russian Jew who came over later. Louis B. Mayer is younger than he is. Doesn't work. Okay, so they're not related. I also couldn't find any of Louis B. Mayer's sisters who had a child who would have been named Edward. So it's just not there. So that connection is not true. So if you heard that story, that one's not real. The IOKA opens in November of 1915, and the first movie they showed was Birth of a Nation, based on the book The Klansman, which was publicized by having people dressed up like Ku Klux Klansmen riding around town on horseback. You have to accept all of our history. And Mayer had great plans for the building. He was going to have a YMCA in it. There was going to be a swimming pool in the downstairs, and there were billiard halls and all sorts of things. None of this ever happened because it went bankrupt within 3 months of opening. And one of the earliest stories that you hear about the IOKA is that IOKA stands for I, O, Kelly, All. The Kelly brothers were the contractors who built the building, and they were based out of Haverhill, Massachusetts, and so it seems likely. And in fact, as you can see, Fred Markey used to love to use this as publicity, and the story shows up in oddball places, such as in the book Peyton Place. So here's the story part. Grace Metalius wrote Peyton Place in 1956. She never lived in Exeter. She was from Manchester, and she was living in Durham when her husband was going to UNH at some point. And so she may have heard the story there. She may have come in town to go to the IOKA. I mean, I don't know if there are any movie theaters in Durham, but here's what she wrote in Peyton Place. Now, this is within the storyline. Sometimes Selina had a little money which she earned by doing some odd job for a local housewife. And then she and Allison would go to a movie at the IOKA Theater. Later, they would sit at the soda fountain in Prescott's drugstore and eat toasted tomato and lettuce sandwiches and drink Coca-Cola. And instead of pretending that they were married to motion picture stars, they would play at being well-to-do local housewives, out for an afternoon stroll, stopping for tea while their infants slept peacefully. Allison held a drinking straw ripped in half as if it were a cigarette and carried on what she considered a grown-up conversation. When Mr. Bean decided to start up the movie theater, she said, he didn't have enough money, so he borrowed from an Irishman named Kelly. That's why the theater is named the IOKA. It stands for I, O, Kelly, All. She drew a great deal of satisfaction out of knowing these little town anecdotes and from repeating them with her own embellishments, while she picked imaginary shreds of tobacco daintily off her tongue. Selina was always an appreciative audience, never mean or stinting with her oohs or oh my goodnesses or her breathlessly disbelieving noes. Oh my goodness, did Mr. Bean ever pay Mr. Kelly back? Asked Selina. Oh, sure, said Allison. And then after a moment's pause in which she answered, a better answer occurred to her. No, wait a minute. He didn't. No, he never paid Mr. Kelly back. He ascended with the funds. So, although the Kelly brothers did actually construct the building, we have all what happens in the bankruptcy later on, and they're not listed as creditors. They were paid long before the theater opened and long before it was given its name. The IOKA, until later, always said, always a good show. That was their tagline. And the whole question of who named the IOKA was later ironed out when one of the managers, James Rathbone, said, no, that has nothing to do with the Kelly brothers. It was named, Mr. Mayer had the people who he had hired to work there at a contest, and everybody could just say what they wanted. And then this man wrote into the newsletter to say, Alan Griffin, and he wrote in to say, no, my sister won that prize. She named it the IOKA because she was really involved in, he says Girl Scouting, but we all know he means Campfire Girls because there's no Girl Scouts in Exeter at this time. And the Campfire Girls have a whole booklet that talks about Indian names that you can use for other things. And one of them is IOKA, which means beautiful playground or Indian playground, something like that. So Mr. Griffith says it was his sister who actually named the IOKA. And that seems plausible because it's two people who were there at the time. So unfortunately, that's not who it was. It was Jessie Griffith. And her brother is the person who confirms that. With all of the things in Exeter that appear to not be true that I've shared with you, we have so many things that are true that are nutty that we may as well look at some of those. And this is one of them. You recognize this cannon? Anybody? Yeah, where is it? Gilman Park, correct. 1897, the United States government was trying to get rid of all of its old Civil War stuff. They had cannons, they had cannonballs, they had all kinds of junk kicking around. And so they offered it to individual towns. They said, you can beautify your town by putting up cannons, which is a little weird, but okay. So Exeter got 3 of them. 2 large cannons, 1 really large cannon, and we were just setting out Gilman Park at that time, so it seemed like a good place to put them. So the cannons went into Gilman Park. They also sent 69 cannonballs. One of the cannons disappeared when it was blown up by some vandals. That's a whole nother story. Blew it to smithereens, and now you can't do that anymore because they're filled with cement. But at the time you could. But the question of the 69 cannonballs was interesting. Within 20 years of the cannons being put into place in 1897, the cannonballs disappeared. They're just gone. And they weigh a ton, by the way. They're really heavy. What happened to them? Well, apparently it's really fun to get all liquored up and go into the Gilman Park and roll them into the river. In 1929, the river was low, and they dredged it, and they found 18 cannonballs. So what did they do? They pulled them out, they piled them up next to the cannons and said, don't do that. Don't do that. And then there were no cannonballs again. So in 2009, they were doing a study. As I mentioned earlier, we removed our dam, and this is just above the dam. So they were doing a study. They dropped the river down, and what did they do? They found 3 cannonballs. So the 3 cannonballs that you see here now live at the Historical Society, where they are hard to move. I'd like to just say that. There's no river that you can roll it into. We did have a couple of kids one time who came over. We found them, we caught them on the security camera that we have, and they had rolled them to the other side of the parking lot, and then volunteers who did not want to be doing this kind of thing had to roll them all the way back. So don't do it. We'll find you. But what this does mean is that there are still 66 rogue cannonballs somewhere in this town. Maybe in the river, but they've dropped that so low in years, we don't know where it went. So the cannonballs are out there. If you find one, if you are clearing out your dad's garden or something, no questions asked, we'll put them with ours. We did a little series on one of our history minutes of strange things found in the river. We got a collection at the Historical Society of photographs from the fire and police department, and some of them are labeled really well, and some of them are not labeled really well. And this one had a label on it, which was really strange. It said, "Looking for the other leg, 1955. And that was a strange story. But I have volunteers there who will search for anything. So they went through the newsletter, and they managed to find the story of the leg. But picture the summer of 1955. It is a hot 4th of July weekend. Hot 4th of July weekend. And a man is down by the river, and he's just bringing in his boat. He's been out fishing. And he looks over, and he sees a human leg cut off at the thigh, like right about here, floating in the river. So he panics a bit, and he has to go find a phone because there's no cell phones yet. And he calls the police, and the police are like, oh my God, there's a body in the river somewhere. So huge force comes out to try and find, this only looks like one boat. It's just one picture, okay? There's more people there. And everybody's called out, and they're looking for a body in the river. And it gets publicized, and a woman in town sees them, and it says in the article, you know, we found a leg, there's got to be more to this body. And there's a woman who's reading this in the paper, and she goes, oh no, I think I know about that leg. So here you have to use your imagination a little bit as to what this phone call might have been like. Her husband worked in the phys ed department at Phillips Exeter Academy. And for a long time, he had a cadaver leg preserved, kept in their garage. And he used it so he could manipulate the leg to see how motion worked and, you know, to help his runners and such. And he had it in the garage. And at some point in time, his wife must have said, "Honey, the leg needs to go. Take care of it." And it's 1955, so no, we don't have the kind of disposal of hazardous materials that we have today. And he probably thought he was fine. Wraps it up in some string, throws it in the river. So that weekend, while the police and Fish and Game and everybody is looking for a dead body in the river, he's not home. He's off at a conference somewhere, and she had to call him and try to picture that conversation, which must have gone something like, "Honey, I'm not calling them. You are." So the story pretty much ends there because he called, he apologized, he said, "Yeah, it's my leg. I owned that leg, and it's okay, and I bought it, and it's legal, and it's fine." And the whole thing had to end. But just imagine how that conversation went. Was this the strangest thing ever found in the Exeter River? I don't know. Because in 2007, they found a 1997 Crown Victoria police car, which had been missing from Southampton for 10 years. It was off of Gilman Park. It was somewhere near the Cannonballs. And the water there is surprisingly deep. And somebody gave them a tip to the police, and they found this. I was thinking, finding a Crown Victoria in the water is just amazing. So that is probably the strangest thing that was found in the river. There were no bodies in it. It's nothing like that. But we'll end with the Moses Kent house. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Oh, good. So we'll end with the Moses Kent house that I started this story off with. In a Facebook community page that summer, I was just reading along, and again the story shows up about this house on Pine Street. And again, it's the story that everyone's heard. That's the house from the Addams family. No, it isn't. It's the house from the Munsters. Everybody knows the story. Everybody knows that's the house. Everybody doesn't seem to realize that every New England town has one of these houses. But the story went on because those two TV shows came out the same year, in 1964, and they both had these sort of creepy-looking houses. Mostly the common story we heard was that it was the Addams Family house. People who said Munsters were usually like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." The truth is, it's the Addams Family. The Addams Family was filmed in California. It seems very unlikely that they would come all the way to Exeter, New Hampshire to film this one house to use as the backdrop. But people, when it comes to the Facebook community page, sometimes when I read these stories, I hang back. I'm not going to get myself involved because I can be the disenchantress too many times. I can wreck people's history too many times. So I don't like to do that because, you get mad at me. So I left it alone for a long time, and then just happened to say, I don't think that's the house. That's not the house. That's the Addams Family house. It's similar, right? It's a Second Empire house, what people call a Gothic house, but that's the time period it was built. The Moses Kent house was built in 1867, I believe. It's it's one of a few Empire-style buildings that were built in town. The Robinson Seminary was built at the same time. The Moses Kent house was built, and believe it or not, I think the Merrill block also has a similar style to it. So it's just a very common building style at that time, and it was not used as the Addams Family house. Even though there are similarities, the actual Addams Family house can be easily found by spending 10 minutes online. These are the two side by side. I'm just comparing the two. You can see they're a little bit similar, but the cupola is a lot different. And the top of the Addams Family house is completely painted on, because that's what it really looks like. It's quite different. If you want to know the address, it's at 21 Chester Place in LA. It was recently torn down, and it was definitely not used for the Addams Family. They didn't use our building for it. My favorite picture, there's Gomez standing in front of it, and you'll notice that they didn't show the top of it because the cupola is fake. Sorry about that. Okay, other stories that we've heard over the time, because we're finished with most of this, but there are other stories, and you may have other stories that you've heard too. Older stories, there was a tree that stood on the border between Exeter and Hampton that was called the Bridal Elm. And there were so many different stories about why it was called the Bridal Elm. Some of them were very sad stories about a couple eloping. Others were like, this is where weddings were held in the colonial era. There's all kinds of stories about the Bridal Elm. And we don't really know what the actual truth was, and it was eventually chopped down. Another story that was really popular in the late 1990s and early aughts was that the big house that was built down on the river by Phyllis Carey, she's the one who owned it, but the story that went all through the schools was that Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen were gonna live there while they attended the academy. They did not. It was owned by one person, and it has since been sold since then. So I collect these stories. Someone told me that they heard that an actor named Lucas McCain, who was in The Rifleman, lived on Pine Street. Has anyone ever heard that story? Cannot confirm or deny, but someone told me that one. There are stories of haunted lamp posts in town, although no one seems to be able to tell me which one or where it was. The kids at Lincoln Street School, and I hope they hold this story forever because it's great, is that the Lincoln Street School stands right in front of the site of the old Robinson Female Seminary, which burned down in 1961. And the kids love the story of the Robinson Seminary ghost. Even if you ask them what it's all about, they don't really know, but they don't care because they're in 4th grade. And it's fine. And another interesting story that I didn't have time to get into is the story of Gilman Marston's statue. Gilman Marston was a Civil War general from Exeter, New Hampshire, and after his death, his regiment put up a monument for him, and he asked, just put a big granite boulder, that's all I want. And that's what they did. And then a number of years later, another one of his supporters put a statue on it of an infantryman standing, and it's gone. It's just gone. And we have photos of when it was there, but it's not there anymore. And there's all sorts of stories about what could have happened to the statue, and I don't have any accounts of its disappearance. I don't have any older Exeter citizens who remember it, and that's one of my usual sources. I will ask older citizens, I'm like, do you remember this? You know, things that I think are nuts, and then I will talk to someone, and they're like, oh yeah, I remember that. The big silver gas ball that was down on the area where Swayze Parkway is today, I had been told about that by so many people. I was like, pictures or it didn't happen. And we found pictures. It existed. It was real. I mean, who would have thought? But Gilman Marston's statue is another one of those things. For a while, I was beginning to think it was imaginary, but we do have photos of it. But where it went, don't know. We're still working on that story. All right, I'm going to open it up to questions. I don't know if I have any answers for you. I apologize if I have destroyed your fun history from your childhood. I can hear you. Okay.
I got to see it one night.
No evidence of a swimming pool at the IOKA as far as you can recall.
Or the bowling alley, although
No bowling alley.
claims there was the bowling alley.
I've heard there was a bowling alley, yeah.
My question to you, though, was where...
I don't know what they did with the leg. I mean, I don't know what you do with a disembodied leg of an unknown person. My question, of course, is where did it come from? Well, I suppose they still sell body parts today. This is gross, but...
One last thing I wanted to say is that Munster House...
Yeah, I think those old houses are, since the Munsters, they've gotten a reputation for being creepy, but really they were very elegant architecture in their day, and it was something people aspired to, was to get a big house like that, rather than it being creepy. It makes you wonder what we're going to look at as creepy one day from our world, things that we think are perfectly normal.
Okay, so yes, this is projecting.
Yep.
Hi. Oh, it does work now, huh? Listen, I'm very, very, very impressed with your skills and your research skills in the years you've put into this. I don't think any other town probably has a person like you doing the type of work that you're doing. I mean, you're one of a lot of people do research on their family histories, and they get it once and they take it as gospel. I have a friend, she'd have to have at least 3 or 4, validations before she'd put anything in. I have the feeling that you are too.
We try. Sometimes you can't do it, but most of the time we try.
I've never seen a town that tells so many lies in my life. They're all making up stories. The only true thing I got out of this is, and I forgot what it was.
Amos Tuck was an honorable person.
Yeah.
And in terms of free soil politics, I think we should not diminish that. I mean, he had that, and he was justifiably proud of it.
Yeah, the starting of the Republican Party, that's not
Yeah, I wish he had.
That's not a definite. It's like Newburyport. They say the Coast Guard. It's the home of the Coast Guard. Some other city says it's them, But anyway, it's a little disappointing to know all these stories that were made up.
Well, stories keep a community alive. Remember that. They help us to explain things we don't want to explain, or they can make us a little less uptight than we really are.
Yeah.
So we can tell funny stories, and probably they get a little funnier every time they're told, which helps.
I'm just curious to ask, why is the society yellow brick when there's so much red? Or did it predate the red?
Why is the Historical Society made out of yellow brick instead of red brick? That's a good question. The architectural firm that built that building in 1897, Roach and Tilden. What's Jackie's giving me the finger like? Do you know? 1893, excuse me. Nope. No, the local brickyard, the most prominent bricks used were bricks from Eno's brickyard, out where Brickyard Pond is today, and Brickyard Playing Fields that the rec department owns. That was Eno's brickyard. They were a French-Canadian family who came in town and made all those bricks, and when they went out of business in the 1960s, Phillips Exeter Academy bought all of their backstock. And so buildings that were built even after that time, such as the Louis Kahn Library, are built out of Eno's water-struck bricks made right here in Exeter. So, good on them, huh?
Any other questions?
I think I remember once seeing a sign in town that said that the town of Exeter once was the capital of the United States. Is that accurate?
It was the capital of the state of New Hampshire. So we had that. During the American Revolution, the capital of the province had always been Portsmouth. But Portsmouth was right on the water. It was, liable to get attacked by the British, and the place was crawling with Tories. So they moved it inland to Exeter, and it went back and forth between Exeter and Portsmouth for a number of years before it finally settles in Concord as the state enlarges and more people moved in state. So it wasn't the capital of the country. That would be cool. I like that story. Let's start that rumor tonight.
When Abraham Lincoln spent a few days in Exeter, and where he stayed, nobody knows. When I was a kid, into my teens, we visited a friend of the family who was a teacher at Exeter High School. A lot of people remember Liz Brady, high school teacher. He lived in an apartment upstairs, the corner of Front Street and Elm Street. House is still there. It's right on the corner next to the post office. And she always claimed that Lincoln stayed here in this bedroom. And for a long time, I said, well, it must be true. She knows what she's talking about. And then later, I've heard other stories about he definitely stayed here. He stayed here. Somebody knows.
When we did our big Lincoln sesquicentennial celebrations back in 2010, we researched the daylights out of this. And I think we came up with about 6 different places that people thought he stayed. Well, she can take that to the grave and be happy, so that's great. It seems like he should have stayed. It seems like he should have stayed at the Squamscott, right, where Amos Tuck didn't found the Republican Party. But I mean, everybody thought, well, they didn't think that back then, right? Nobody knew that until 1887. But anyway, it seems like that would have been a logical place. There were about 3 other little boarding houses, hotels that were in town at that time that he could have stayed at. The thing that throws you on that, though, is that if the Squamscott really had Abraham Lincoln stay there, they would have publicized that. They would have changed their name to the Lincoln. They would have used that in later years, and they never mention it. We don't have any of the guest books. One of the places he stayed when he was in Concord does have his signature where he stayed. That's also a little suspect, because if any place in town had Abraham Lincoln stay there, after the time of his death, they would have framed that, and it would have been on the wall, right? So what I think is most likely, although I'm not going to say that this is true, but I think what's most likely is he just stayed with Bob at his rooming house. We know that he had Sunday dinner there, and Robert was he was boarding over at the building, sometimes called the Folsom Block. As you're heading out of town over Great Bridge, you know that brick building that's got the curve on it? Yeah. Okay. In the straight part of that building on the 3rd floor, I think, is where Bob boarded while he was here in Exeter. He probably just stayed with Bob. That ruins it, though. So let's go with the 6 places that we think he might have stayed, because then we can all have our own little fantasy.
Is the Tuck School at Dartmouth named after Amos Tuck?
It is. It's named for Amos Tuck by his son, Edward Tuck. And it's at Dartmouth that Mark Willis was able to find the letter that unfortunately misproves the one thing our town can be really proud of. Blame Mark. That's where the letter was found. All right, well, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I appreciate
Thank you, Barbara.
Here.